Today we're going to make bagels. And I'm really excited that we're joined today by Lindy Mechefski. Lindy is a food blogger, she's a food author, and she also writes a column in the Kingston Week Standard. So it's really nice to have you here.
Thank you,
So
Sue.
you're familiar with how regular bagels are made with wheat. So hopefully we can teach you a little bit about how things work in the gluten-free world.
Excellent, look forward to it.
Terrific. So what we're going to do, this is a yeast dough, as bagels are. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by blooming the yeast. So we're going to start with some warm water. We've got some sugar that's going to feed the yeast. And then we're just going to let the yeast sit in the warm water and sugar so that it can bloom and start to get working. Now, we've got some other interesting things here. This recipe uses white rice flour. It uses tapioca starch. We've got some skim milk powder. This is going to give it some depth of flavor, and it's also going to give it some body and some strength. We've got some salt, we've got some sugar, and we've got some gum. We've used gum before in the program. This particular recipe, we have to use a lot of gum. We need the dough to be nice and thick so that we can work with it and shape it into the bagels properly. So let's just add these together. One thing about working with gluten-free, because you're not concerned about developing the gluten in something, often our recipes, you can just dump things all together. So all of our dry ingredients can go together. There we go. Just gonna mix this, blend this for a moment. Our yeast is starting to work. So what we're gonna do now is we're going to add some egg whites. I usually buy egg whites in a carton, but you can also separate the yolks and the whites. There is going to be another wet ingredient at the end. This wet ingredient is warm water, and it's also shortening. Solid shortening that has been melted in the warm water. This gives the bagels a really nice depth of flavor with the fat from the shortening, makes it more like a pastry. So this is a little unique what we do in the hot water and the shortening, and we can add that as a liquid at the end. So the yeast has started to bloom. So let's just add our dry ingredients. This dough is going to get quite thick. I've worked with this recipe and other bagel recipes for about 5 years before I figured out some of the real tips to make this recipe special so that it worked. If you've ever tried to make gluten-free bagels, you'll know that they're very sensitive to temperature and handling. So when I've tried to make them and shape them and then boil them off as bagels should be boiled, then I wasn't able to let them rise again. So we figured out a couple of really great tips. And once you've made these once, you'll want to make them again and again. They also freeze really well. This particular recipe makes 10 bagels. Ooh, there's lots of flour in this one. What you'll find with this dough is it's starting to come off the sides, and that's what you want. You want it to be a fairly dry dough, but you want it to be really well mixed. So Lindy, now that we've got the dough just about made, you can come down and I can show you how to make this into bagels.
Perfect, can't wait.
Great. So I'm joined again by Lindy Mechefski, who's a food writer, and I'm going to teach you how to make gluten-free bagels. So we've made the dough, and we're going to now shape it. There's the dough. You can see what it feels like. It's really thick, and we can actually feel it and touch it.
It's just like Play-Doh.
It is. It's not terribly sticky. Tastes a lot better than Play-Doh, believe me. So it's best if you can measure it out in some sort of a scoop or by weight. I can tell you that this scoop weighs between 120 and 125 grams. So let me make a couple of those to start with, and then I'll show you how we make bagels with them. So this can go really quickly. This recipe will make 10 bagels. We're going to shape 6 into bagels, and then we're going to do something special with the other 4. So this is very forgiving. And if some are a little larger or some are a little smaller, that's not a problem. Now the reason that we can work so well with this dough right now, even though it's a yeast dough, is because it's so thick. And that had to do a lot with the amount of gum that we put in it. Because it's so thick, the yeast doesn't really have a chance yet to rise. So we're going to give the yeast a chance a little later. But let's first start shaping. So I'll give you this one.
Thank you.
And I'm going to start with this one. We'll do is put our hands in water. We did this before when we worked with some other doughs. Yep. And what you're going to do is shape this into a disc, a flattened disc. Don't worry if you get some cracks in it. This is just the first process into making the bagels. Now you're going to shove your thumbs in from the top or your fingers up from the bottom.
Aha.
Yep.
You can see you're an expert.
I've done this thousands of times.
And if it splits?
If it splits, just piece it back together. It's very forgiving. It will, it'll all come out looking like a bagel. So by moving it around in your hands, you can get that sort of roundish shape. Yeah, there we go.
That's amazing. It's so different than yeast dough.
Yeah, so with it is a yeast dough, but with wheat dough, what you would normally do is roll it into a great big long rope and then fold it over at the ends. And that really doesn't work very well with this dough. Like I said, I've used this method many, many times. Now, once we get them like this, we could just let them rise. But as you probably know, Lindy, the way to make proper bagels is to boil them.
Right.
So once we let them rise, if I was to boil them right away, then by the time I'm ready to put them in the oven, they would have flattened. You getting the hang of it?
No one's going to hire me.
Here you go. You start on another one and I'll fix that. So you might want to use a little less water on your hands.
It's a bit like working with pottery.
It is actually. It's like clay, and it does stick back together. But you'll see from the other things that we're going to do that there's a lot more that's going to happen with this dough that's going to make it look like bagels.
Aha. I might be getting it.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Yeah, we'll just make it a little bigger, because what you want to do is you want to make sure that the hole in the center is large enough that when it all starts to rise, that it doesn't close up.
Right, of course.
Unless, of course, you want that to close up and use it more like a sandwich. So there we go. So we've got 6 of these now. So before we do anything else with these, we're going to use up the rest of the dough. Now, I don't know whether you realize it or not, but if you're at a ballpark or an autumn fair, you'll often find those great big pretzels that people like to eat with salt and maybe mustard on them. I love those. And I really wanted to make those once I was gluten-free. And I found out that it's virtually the same dough. Bagels and those great big pretzels.
Interesting. Is that the same with wheat dough?
I think they might use a little bit of a difference in it, but when I looked into what would make this one different, there wasn't anything in it. Right. So I was really happy with working with this dough. So what I've done is I portioned out the same amount, and we're going to use a similar method, but a little bit different. So There you go.
Okay,
So we're going to get our hands wet.
but not so wet.
It doesn't have to be super wet, but what you want to do is you just want to make it into a rope. If you start rolling it, it's so thick it won't roll very well. But what you want to do is, I find that it works well on a table or a counter, and you want to make it about 18 inches long. These are not going to look very pretty at first.
We're going to get this dough to 18 inches long?
Yep.
Okay.
It's not going to look very pretty when you first start working with it, but as you go along, it will rise and it will bake and it will boil and it will do all these wonderful things, and it will work. So this one is about the right length. So what I'm going to do, normally with a pretzel they twist it a couple of times. We don't do anything quite so elaborate. We just make it like that. Again, not terribly pretty. We've got some cracks in the edge of the dough, but those will go away. Those will heal up as we go along. So, yeah, you're doing great. Just try and make it about the same thickness all around. And again, with the pretzels, it doesn't really, you don't really have to have big spaces in between. The spaces in between are really to let the water go through and let it bake evenly. So if the spaces come together, that's not a problem.
Okay, so approximately
fine.
right length?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then so, yeah, so you're going to start with one side and put it
And
up.
then lift this one over
Yep.
top.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, it's not quite perfect, but
Oh, it takes a little bit of practice, but guess what? You get to eat your mistakes. That's not a problem at all. Here, why don't you take this one and you can do the folding.
okay. And this is long enough, ready to go?
Yep, that one should be ready to go.
Okay.
To fold it. Yep. And if I have a little bit of dough left over, I usually just make little tubes with them.
Okay.
And then I get to test those just after they come out of the oven. I don't have to wait very long. So we'll have these done up. So as you can see, you can make with the same dough. We've got bagels and we've got these pretzels. And let's just put that around.
Nice.
Okay. There. Now, the secret here is these go in the freezer.
Oh, okay.
So you wouldn't normally do that with wheat dough, but these are going in the freezer, and they're going to stay in the freezer for 2 to 3 hours. That's the secret to keeping the shape and keeping the size.
Interesting.
So what we're going to do is I'm going to put a pot of water on the stove. I'm going to get some out of the freezer that I made earlier, and we can watch the rest of the process.
Excellent.
So Lindy, we've let these bagels go in the freezer, and they're now nice and hard. And so we're now going to put them into boiling water. So, oops, there we are.
So why do we boil them?
The boiling water is what allows them to have that chewy exterior. So it's not like a regular bread that has a sort of a soft crust. They've got this really chewy exterior, and then you can open them up and they're nice and dense inside. It protects the dough inside, and it also strengthens the dough on the outside. So we put them in. So we put something that's frozen into boiling water. Now in the water we also have sugar, and the sugar helps that coating on the outside to get a little bit thicker and to be shinier when we're finished.
How much sugar would be in there?
This is about 8 to 12 cups of water in here, and there's about half a cup of sugar.
Right.
So it's not really sweet, but it's enough to affect it. Now I know that there are people who put baking soda and different other things in. I find sugar works best. You usually have lots of sugar in your house, and so sugar is an easy thing to put in. And so these were, like I said, frozen. So by the time we take them out, they're still going to be frozen in the center. But the foolproof thing here is they sink to the bottom, and then when they rise to the top, they're ready to be removed. So in a bakery where they make wheat bagels, it's a similar process. They boil them, and when they rise to the top, they're ready. You can see that one's already risen to the top. And this is a chemical thing. It has to do with the air heating up in the air pockets inside, and it's like a lighter than
The density, of course,
the density becomes less than what the water is. So they rise to the top. I usually keep stirring them so they don't stick on the bottom. And then once I remove them from here, I'm going to put them into an ice water bath. So we're just about ready to do that. You might every once in a while get a stubborn one. Just leave it. You can't overdo it with this.
Right.
If you do overdo it, then you'll start to see that they're starting to rise in this warm bath. That's when you want to make sure you remove them. So these have floated to the top a few minutes ago. So as you can see, they've started to rise a bit. They're looking really nice and doughy. We're going to take these out.
And how long do they stay in the cold water bath?
Until they've cooled.
Right.
Until you can handle them. I'm just going to put a few more in. I did make a different kind of bagel, which we can talk about after, some multigrain bagels. Let's just put those in. And usually for the second batch, we'll often have to put the lid on because you're putting obviously frozen things into boiling water. You want to bring it up to a boil again. So these will at some point sink down. That means that they're cool enough to remove and put onto a pan. So let me now show you what we do next.
Excellent.
Lindy, if you wouldn't mind taking those out of there, you can just use your hands. The water's cold, so that they go into an ice water bath and the ice will dissipate because you're putting something that's very hot into it. Leave some space in between those because that's going to be, we'll probably get about 6 on that tray, because once they go into the oven, so these need to cool. Once they go into the oven, they're going to expand a lot. So now these are the pretzels. They look like pretzels, but they're a little rough around the edges. They still have some rising to do. So let's put those into the water as well. Same process.
So this is a process that you actually perfected.
It's a process that starts out with the way bagels are made, and then I worked with it because gluten-free bagels work a little bit differently. And normally what you do with wheat bagels is you'd let them rise and you'd be able to pick them up and put them in the water, and then they would come out like this, and then you'd put them in the oven and they'd finish off. But right now, if you were to do that with our dough, it would rise, come in the water, and then become very delicate.
Right.
And once you put them on the tray before you bake them, they would have sunk. So by freezing them, it helps, it changes the structure of them, and it helps keep that shape and then gives them a real fighting chance in the oven.
And you basically discovered this by trial and error.
Trial and error. It took me years. I wanted bagels so desperately that I just kept trying different methods. And I like reading cookbooks. You're a food author, and I'm sure you like reading cookbooks as well. I like reading cookbooks like other people like reading novels. And I stumbled across a couple of different cookbooks where people used freezing as a method to stabilize something. And so for me, that bells went off in my head, and I thought, let's try it. And it worked first time off.
I think that's genius.
So we're going to let these pretzels do the same thing, but why don't we take those over to the table and we can dress them and get them ready for the oven.
Excellent.
So now we've got our boiled and cooled bagels. So they've gone in the boiling water, then they've gone in the ice water, and they're cool now to the touch. They're a little sticky, and they're just waiting to get into the oven. But before they go into the oven, I want to dress them. Now, if I was just to put the poppy seeds or the sesame seeds or the oatmeal on now, it won't stick to them.
Right.
So what I've done is I've got a mixture of some sugar and some hot water in a spray bottle, and we used to do this with them by the hundreds, and this will allow the outside garnishes to stick to them. In regular wheat baking, they would have a great big bowl of it and throw the bagels in and be able to throw them around. Well, ours are a little more delicate than that. So if you would put the poppy seeds, why don't you put poppy seeds on those two? And this again, you can put as many or as little as you want. I'm putting sesame seeds on this one. I'll leave one plain. And yeah, just sprinkle, just cover them in poppy seeds, that's fine. Again, you can do it as much or as little as you want. Now, I've also made some multigrain ones, and I found that the best garnish for multigrain ones was some of the instant oats. These are smaller than the oats that I've used in cookies and that sort of thing, but this goes really well. If you're concerned that they're not sticking, you can always press them down a little bit. But we found that there was really good adherence when we used the sugar water on them.
And this is a beautiful combination.
Isn't this nice? Well, you'll get to taste the multigrain ones after. They're really different. They're really nice. So we've got bagels here. Now the other way that I make bagels is with dried blueberries in them. And you can get dried blueberries, and I just do a rough chop on them. And just before I'm about to form them into the shapes, I add some of the blueberries into one of the portions and mix that around, and they come out really nice as well. These are the pretzels that we made. They've been boiled and they've been cooled. We don't garnish these before we put them in the oven. So let's put both of these, if you wouldn't mind picking that up, we'll put both of these in the oven now. They go in at 425. Now they're going to be in for about 30 to 35 minutes. They take a little while, but it's well worth the wait.